Well, good day. So, for today's video, we're gonna talk about the first cartoon appearance of one of the most influential bands that ever existed. I'm talking about the Beatles. So, alright, cuckoo-ca-choo!
Yeah. So, we start off at the Transylvania Hilton because inside the Beatles are rehearsing. You know, the Beatles! John, Paul, George, and Ringo. But these rehearsals are not really going that great. All these Transylvanians are really excited to see the Beatles and are crowding the rehearsal space. They're getting in the way of the Fab Four. You know, like getting into Ringo's snare drum, attacking John with his own guitar chords. This is no way to rehearse. Thankfully, Ringo has a suggestion. He knows of this other place where they can rehearse at. This other place is apparently really big and, most importantly, it's completely empty. And thusly, the boys go. And this place, as it turns out, is a giant castle. A spooky giant castle with its own graveyard attached. So, you know, like the Beatles are starting to feel a little terrified. This place might actually be haunted, you know, like that's crazy. Maybe we should just rehearse in the big crowds instead of, you know, with like ghosts and stuff. And things get even worse when a giant green-skinned man pops out of a crypt. A big green guy pops out of a crypt? Oh my god, it's a zombie! Get out of there! Wait, no, wait. Not a zombie. This guy is actually pretty pleasant and alive. Also, he speaks English quite eloquently. Turns out he is just the caretaker of the castle. He only moved into the crypt because it's nice and cool down there. Kind of macabre, you know, but I guess it checks out. So, phew, zombie disaster averted, and the caretaker gives the Beatles the thumbs up to use the castle as a rehearsal space. Later, inside the castle. So yeah, like the place is big and empty, and the acoustics are awesome, and therefore the rehearsal is going quite smoothly. Until another giant monster pops up in the castle and starts chasing after the quartet. So yeah, hey, like needless to say, these guys are freaked out as they run around the castle. They wind up in a bedroom, you know, where they think they could be safe, but no! Because that's where the ghost is sleeping. The ghost? Oh my god, run away! So now they're running through this castle and they're getting chased by more and more monsters. Monsters of all kinds, right? Like vampire, a witch, wolfman, a Frankenstein creature, which, yes, is a Frankenstein. He's the son of Dr. Frankenstein, so therefore he is a Frankenstein. And some other monsters as well. And well, at this point, the Beatles are completely surrounded in a castle by all of these different types of grotesque creatures. Oh, well, there goes their career, hey? And well, I guess more importantly, their lives, because they're now totally screwed. What can they do, right? Nothing! That's what! And, well, actually, they don't have to do anything because, as it turns out, these monsters actually really loved the music that they were playing earlier during their rehearsal. They only showed up, you know, because it was so amazing. They haven't heard music in over 200 years in the castle, so they ask politely for the Beatles, you know, to just continue playing. And play they do, as they play the title of this featured episode, A Hard Day's Night. Great fun is had by all. At the end of the song, the monsters take off and leave, even though I thought they wanted to hear music, not just one song, which is odd. And even more odd, at the end of it, the Beatles all turn green and, die? Oh my god, are they dead? They did what the monsters wanted! What the? Or, no, maybe not dead. Did they just pass out from fear? But they turned green. Like, what is that? Did they, like, get some stomach flu or something? I don't know what's happening. But, either way, with that, that is the end of this Fab Tale.
Man, that was pretty awesome, actually. I am a pretty big fan of the Beatles, and to see them in anything else besides music videos is always really good. Their live action movies are pretty sweet, and this cartoon, man, I don't know, there's something off about it, but it's still pretty good. I think the show really would have benefited if they had a laugh track involved in it, Those old canned laugh tracks are pretty cheesy, but this episode was pretty cheesy too. The whole corniness, of the story and of how the characters are portrayed really goes well with a lot of the other Beatles movies and stuff, so that's pretty hip. But one thing that really throws you off is, some of the voice actors for some of the Beatles. Like, say, for Paul and Ringo, not an exact impersonation of the two, but it's close enough to kind of muddle through, right? John and George do not sound anything like John and George. I don't think John even had a British accent. You could have just had Arnold Schwarzenegger doing the voice, and that still would have been the same. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. Actually, that would have been pretty awesome. But it is pretty cool. It does have that Halloween vibe, and even though it's a really short episode, they told the story that they wanted to, so, good for them. So, if you haven't seen this show before, I would suggest you do. It is pretty neat. They do have a couple stories. They have a couple of other kind of comedy segments, in between the different stories, and it's pretty good. And of course, it's the Beatles, and they play their songs all the way through, so you can't go wrong with that. But with that, we do have some more behind-the-scenes kind of things, with the Beatles, with this cartoon series, and other stuff kind of going on over here.
So yes, indeed, hey? The Beatles! One of the greatest bands of all time, and arguably the most influential band of all time. But how did they get to that plateau? Well, let us take a tiptoe through the time tulips and look at their humble beginnings. And everything started off in 1956, when musician John Lennon and a bunch of his friends from high school decided to form a band. Seeing as they all attended Quarry Bank High School, they decided to name their band the Quarrymen, as that is how people from Quarry High School are referred to as Quarrymen. So they were a band that had a, fairly diverse set of music. It would all be cover songs, really, for the most part. They played to what is referred to as skiffle music. Technically, folk music that has a lot of influences with blues, country, bluegrass, jazz, stuff like that. Also, a whole bunch of rock and roll, seeing as, in the 50s, rock and roll was really hitting the scenes. And they were doing pretty good, they're playing gigs here and there, mostly for school stuff, other kind of smaller engagements, just to have a band to dance to and have a really good time with. So things were going pretty good for them. But, seeing as they're all a bunch of high school kids or whatnot, the band had a bit of a revolving door with musicians in it. Eventually, one of John Lennon's friends, Ivan Vaughn, introduced one of his friends to John Lennon, a friend named Paul McCartney, who also played the guitar. The two became friends, and in 1957, Paul joined the Quarrymen. One issue with the Quarrymen is that they did not have a bona fide lead guitarist. They were all pretty good in their own right. Even Paul McCartney tried to be the lead guitarist, but things didn't go that well, so the band was on the look for a bona fide #1 lead guitarist. Paul suggested one of his friends from school, some guy named George Harrison, to which George auditioned. But John, thought that George was a bit young, he was, I think, 14 or 15 at this point. A bit young, especially if the band is playing in bars, you really can't have someone really young in there, because legally, you couldn't have someone underage in a bar, right? But George had more auditions with John, and you really couldn't deny George's, talent. So eventually, he did join the Quarrymen in 1958. And the band was still doing good and good. They changed their names a bunch of times. For example, Johnny and the Moondogs, J Page 3, and even Long John and the Silver Beatles. With Beatles being spelled differently, right? For a double meaning of the bug and a beat like you'd hear in music. Pretty clever, these Beatles! So eventually these Silver Beatles were a 5-piece band that went to Hamburg, Germany to really hammer out all the kinks in their band, their music and whatnot, and really become a full-fledged professional band of musicians. The lineup consisted of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Stuart Sutcliffe on bass guitar, and Pete Best on the drums. Eventually, Stuart decided to leave the band and pursue a career in art, to where Paul McCartney took up the duties of bass player in his absence, and Pete Best was fired by the band because they were not exactly happy with his drum playing, so they replaced him with the drummer from the band, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, the drummer known as Ringo Starr. The band also shortened their name to just simply the Beatles. For one reason, the really unique double usage of the word Beatles and beat, you know. Also, it was a bit of a homage to Buddy Holly, to whom they were all big fans of, because Buddy Holly's band was called The Crickets. The Beatles got to recording a proper album, and their debut single became a massive hit. The song, Love Me Do, which was released in 1962, which was eventually found on their debut album, Please Please Me, which was released in 1963. Because, sometimes singles are released before the full album. The Beatles became massive in England and Europe, and eventually found superstardom in United States as well. So at this point, these guys were legends, right? They pretty much did everything they could in music. Multiple #1 hits, multiple #1 albums. So, the only thing they could do is to venture into other areas. Much like movies. The Beatles starred in their first movie called A Hard Day's Night in 1964. This was followed up with their second movie, Help, which debuted in mid-1965, which were, both pretty interesting movies, and, were pretty successful, so where else could you go, right? Well, that would be the world of cartoons, to which we got to our featured episode in 1965. The Beatles themselves, when they watched this series, at first, they didn't really like it. It did seem like a really cheap cartoon, some cheap animation, things about it weren't exactly right, but eventually over time they really did appreciate this cartoon for what it was, and it brought back a lot of memories for them from their mop-top era. John Lennon did state that he really loved rewatching this series, and even George Harrison would speak fondly of this series later. Further down the road, Todd McFarlane Toys would create a set of figures of the Beatles based on this cartoon series, which I gotta say is pretty fab. But this series, even with its flaws, like I say, is still pretty cool. It's still very Beatle-esque, and you still get to hear all this beautiful music in it. But that's the basics on the Beatles, from where they came from, to the heights they hit, and to this featured episode. Everything else Beatles, we'll get to it when we get to it, because holy crap, there is so much history with the Beatles. But with this, that, those, and the other things, I guess that's that. Also, if you're interested, I created my own comic book channel, 215 Comics, and currently I have created my own cartoon series, The Adventures of the Density, and recently started a radio series featuring my newest character, Elastomorph, with more titles to come. So if you want to check it out, I'll leave a link up top here to that channel, and some links at the end of the video. Yeah! Right on, and there you go. So thanks for watching the video.
I hope you liked it as much as I did making it. Also, feel free to check out the source material that I featured in this video. And if you want to leave a comment on anything you may have liked or things I might have missed in this, feel free to do so. Or anything else, just to say hi. That's cool too. And other than that, have a great day. Thanks.